Good evening. I now call to order the meeting of Planning and Zoning Commission for the City of Apache Junction. Today's date is April 11th and the time is 7 p.m. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, Rudy.
Chairman Hanchey.
Here.
Vice Chair Gage.
Here.
Commissioner Cantwell.
Here.
Commissioner Shanebeck.
Here.
Commissioner Begeman.
Here.
Commissioner Barker.
Here.
Commissioner Callan.
Here.
7 present. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Rudy. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda and minutes?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Rudy, roll call, please.
Commissioner Callan.
Yes.
Chairman Hanchey.
Yes?
Vice Chairman Gage.
Yes.
Commissioner Cantwell.
Yes.
Commissioner Shanebeck.
Yes.
Commissioner Begeman.
Here.
Commissioner Barker.
Yes.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I don't see any thing on for public hearings tonight. We'll move to old business. We have presentation discussion and update for case P-23-16-AM, a proposed text amendment of zoning ordinance, Article 1-7, parking, loading, and circulation regulations regarding requirements for guest parking, electrical vehicle parking, accessible parking, motorcycle, and bicycle parking.
My presentation got closed out. But here we go. All right. Good evening, Planning and Zoning Commission.
Good evening.
As was spoken, my presentation tonight is regarding the proposed parking text amendments. As we have discussed before, this was originally initiated after a lot of discussion over the last year with different projects come in. They all have all sorts of different parking standards, and every time it was a concurrent need, that recurring need, that there was some need to provide guest parking that was not explicitly required by the code. It's like the code had a minimum baseline of for every so many bedrooms there needed to be this much resident parking, but we lacked any kind of explicit per unit guest parking, and that has shown to be a need for several of these projects, just because we didn't want it to spill over, we didn't want it to create any kind of traffic issues in the area, and with that initiative in mind, staff received the direction to study this, to research this, and to provide code recommendations for a proposed text amendment. Now, a couple months ago, so 2 months after that initial direction to staff, we had brought preliminary investigation reports back to you. Since then, we'd also worked on the different aspects of parking provisions that are also not explicitly mentioned by the code, such as things like bicycle parking and electrical vehicle parking. We had mentioned that before. We have come before you tonight with an actual set of recommendations, an actual text of a draft amendment, though further, as we're working on other text amendments to the same article, that will be brought before you for an actual vote at another time. So all of staff's recommendations have come as the result of our professional review of the local need and comparative analysis, just taking different projects, different developments, as well as the codes of different cities, and essentially analyzing this data in order to provide this number. It's a policy is one thing, coming up with a precise number is the result of somewhat number crunching. With that in mind, staff recommends a requirement of 0.3 guest parking spaces for every dwelling unit in a multifamily residential community. That's things like apartments, condos, townhomes, anything that has a dense residential development. Currently, those things are addressed with the residential or per unit space, and this parking requirement would be for every, let's say, 10 spaces, you'd have 3 guest parking spaces. So that 0.3 ratio is what we're looking at. Something that it was also...
Could we go back for that for just a second?
Yes, of course.
That's per dwelling, so it's not per it's not
for 10. Is it really?
0.3 guest parking spaces for every dwelling unit. So if you have 10, then it would be 3 guest parking spaces, in addition to the required
Yep.
resident parking.
Okay.
But
Per dwelling unit?
if you have 3, then it'd be about 1
Okay.
guest
Yeah,
parking
yeah.
space or so forth, so.
Like all-
The accessible parking requirements are something that are actually established and regulated by the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, and they are further codified by our building codes. For this reason, we are not altering any of the accessible parking requirements. However, we have included the actual table saying you were required to have this many accessible parking spaces for every so many spaces. Within the zoning ordinance for greater accessibility as well as convenience, we just wanted everyone to, it's a common question of regarding parking requirements, and to have all this information in one place as we're addressing these different parking requirements, now is the best time to implement that and include that in here.
I think part of that, though, what we wanted to clarify was if those would count towards guest parking as well.
That is a good question, and it's something that we looked at, and it is part of the overall number, and it is being kept that way, at least within our recommendation, because that is how the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act recognizes it, as well as the building code. So if you have 100 spaces, then here's the table actually, of that 100 spaces, 4 would be accessible. Now, if we exclude that from the total number and put it in its own category, then we start coming up with 2 different ratios that start to conflict with the building code and the Americans with Disabilities Act code, and then we have our own ratio, and it just ends up kind of getting jumbled. So it can be done in a few different ways. Phoenix does have a ratio for just handicapped or accessible parking, and then just resident parking. But this is the most streamlined way that is currently, it's regulated the way it is right now. So, but as an answer to that question, we recommend to not include that within the overall number.
Because I'm not so worried about it on our larger ones. It's
Yeah.
when we get into these smaller ones, and, you know, we have to have our X amount of disabled parking spots, and then that can chew into the few guest spots that we have. So in that case, we really need to make sure, because, you know, I want to make sure that we have enough for everybody,
Right.
so.
And I believe we are addressing that through this new ratio, and just for the smaller sites that currently have provided almost no guest parking, having this new ratio in mind and this new provision of guest parking should ensure that there is both guest parking for both those who need accessible parking as well as those without, so,
Well, just take, for example, there's 100 spaces.
yes.
By the way we're working this out, how many of those spaces would be guest?
30, well, sorry,
Okay,
Or 30.
if you have, well, I guess there's a couple ways.
based
to
on
do that
units, but
math.
units have 2 spaces, right?
Right.
So say we have 50 units, which have 100 spaces. We're gonna then add 15 guest spaces. Now, we're gonna add another 3 or 4 handicap. Are they in addition to those guest spaces plus the residents?
They are not in addition to the guest spaces because of the way the Americans with Disabilities Act currently regulates those parking spaces.
So, just to get this algorithm correct, you've got, go back to the 10 buildings. So 10 buildings would require 3 spaces.
3 additional guest spaces, yes.
How many resident spaces are in there? That would be,
So again, it depends on the bedroom count. That's when we get into the original. So if you have 10 units, let's say they're all 2 or 3 bedroom, then you would also have 20 resident
so
spaces
there's 20 residents and
plus
3.
the 3 guest parking
so that's
spaces.
23, and is that when you go to this chart with 23, or do you go with 20?
You would go with 23 out of the total count.
23, okay.
And as for which of those spaces would be required to be accessible, so, they could be allocated in either the guest or in the resident. It depends on the needs of the actual site. If you have, for instance, an accessible unit that would be the one that would likely have the accessible parking site. Now, as is noted, there's generally a need for the guest parking to have an accessible space as well, and that's something that we include within the site design and everything. That's something that we work for when we're working with an applicant, but some of the finer details are part of the finer details of a case-by-case project, like whether there's garages, whether there's outdoor parking, but generally speaking, it's part of the site design that we address during the reviews, but we have not explicitly changed the ratio because at that point, we're running with all these different federal as well as the federal ratios as well as the building codes that currently codify the Americans with Disabilities Act parking ratios. So.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. So you go with the 23, you add the residents and the guests up, and then you from that total number, you go to this chart and get the handicaps.
That's right. And part of that would be, to get into a very fine example, let's say we were right on the threshold where you had 25 parking spots already. Were you to then add guest parking, so between guest parking and resident parking, let's say you already had exactly 25 parking spaces. Were you to include accessible parking spaces as an additional number and require it outside of that standard, then all of a sudden we have 26 parking spaces. But once we have 26 parking spaces, now we're required to have an additional accessible parking space. And that's why, like, in terms of the way the numbers work, it's better to keep it all consolidated within the same ratios rather than adding one ratio on top of another ratio. And that's how we've come to the conclusion in the recommendation.
Gotcha.
Makes sense.
So ADA does not make a differentiation between resident spaces and open spaces. Okay, example would be, the park I live in has 400 homes, okay? Each of them have a two-car garage. So the majority of people are parking in their garage. And if you're handicapped, then you're parking your handicapped vehicle in your garage. In that case would be the appropriate number of extra spaces would then include a number of handicap spots for the entire population or only for the non-garage slots, for lack of a better description.
Generally, the non-garage slots, like when we're looking at something like a park with 400 residences, then the guest parking would not incorporate, like at that point, like let's say just looking at the units of the individual residences, we already have about 800 parking spaces, including the garage. The Americans with Disabilities Act requirement for the guest parking would not be derived from everything, including the garages. It would be derived from the, mostly the on-street available parking.
Okay.
Again, when it gets into the finer details in the case-by-case, that's when we get into multifamily projects that have different configurations of parking that aren't typical of single-family dwellings. Once we get into things like apartments or multi-story developments and townhomes, then we kind of get a little bit of a different parking configuration depending on if they have garages, depending on what's available off-street and so forth.
Yeah, we've seen a couple where, you had two spots, but one was a garage and the other one was on-site parking. And so then the on-site parking available to everybody would then be included in this table.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Cantwell, let me clarify something. In a manufactured home community, there is a different standard. I think our code calls for one guest parking space for every 10 units. Okay, this is specific to manufactured home parks. One guest parking space for every 10 units. There are not any ADA spaces for the individual manufactured homes. The ADA spaces would be required in relation to the clubhouse or possibly other non-residential amenities of the park. But that's not multifamily, that's a completely different
Well,
type of
okay, yeah, that's a
housing.
little bit of what I was driving
Right.
at, and then on the way over here, I also went through Goldfield Estates, I think it is, the new Lennar property.
Uh-huh,
Goldview, yes.
Yeah, and, those are all single-family
Yes.
homes. But any of the ADA spots are around the clubhouse,
Correct.
not around the homes.
correct,
So,
yeah,
that's just kind of the distinction.
yes,
Yes, we have a variety of different
right.
types here. Okay, thank you.
All right. So another item that has come up as we've studied different parking requirements, different regulations, is a compact motorcycle or motor scooter parking stalls. So this is something that has been found to increase safety, as well as just often greater site flexibility, just because these parking spots are a little bit smaller. But they're designed for motorcycles and motor scooters. The reason that this is relevant, for instance, is if you have a motorcycle parked within a vehicle stall, which is often what they have to do, of course, and it's just as a normal thing. You often have a car pull up, they don't realize common cause of I guess, just confusion, just as a mishap within driving. It's something that, just as a study, has been known to be reduced when you actually have dedicated motorcycle or motor scooter parking stalls. So in terms of the best way to include that, the recommendation is that when you have inside a commercial parking lot, so we're not going to change single-family residential subdivisions, or even, it's not as relevant even when we're just looking at a multifamily development, but specifically within non-residential parking lots, for every 75 parking spaces, 2 of those shall be a motor scooter parking stall. And because those are smaller, more condensed, it's been found to allow for greater parking configuration diversity or flexibility. But this recommendation is put forward out of the concern and idea of safety, as well as just that benefit, that we have a lot of bikers within the city of Apache Junction when it comes to motorcycles, and motor scooters being these little mopeds. But this is a recommendation that we put forth. So out of every 75 motor vehicle parking spaces, 2 shall be motor scooter stalls. Also notable within the city of Apache Junction as a growing thing, we have a lot of bicyclists. Right now within the code, there is nothing regarding any kind of bicycle parking, any bicycle stalls, or bicycle racks. So looking at different cities, different requirements, as well as just a needs-based assessment of how frequently people do ride their bike, how many people you would expect at once to be riding and parking a bike, and so forth. Staff has proposed to include bicycle parking standards as part of the parking requirements. So when we have a multifamily residential development or commercial development, so that based on the amount of parking on site, you would then have an allocation, and in this case, an additional allocation of bicycle parking stalls that can take the place of, for instance, when you have like the inverted U, you could park parallel, 1 bicycle on one side, 1 bicycle on the other. Just that 1 rack already provides 2 bicycle parking spaces. There's already many businesses within the community that do provide bicycle parking, but just as something that to be aware of, and to be aware of the need, and to address the need in advance with new development, staff has recommended to include this within the parking regulations. On a similar note of upcoming need and growth when it comes to new development, the electrical vehicle parking requirements have something that have been asked about repeatedly within past public hearings with different developments. It's something that the code does not address, especially as a new technology. So with this, staff has researched different things, again, looking at our community needs. I'm looking at least as a baseline of where to start. We currently propose that for every 250, so within larger parking lots, things like Fry's, within every 250 motor vehicle parking spaces, 1 of those spaces shall be equipped with an electrical vehicle charging station. So again, when we're looking at large sites, like the Fry's shopping center, which has I believe we've done the count, somewhere upwards of about 800. Even then, you'd only have about 3 to 4 electrical vehicle parking stations. We didn't want this to become burdensome to developers, so this is specifically in mind with larger developments, but it is also something that addresses the need because range anxiety is a thing. People don't know where electrical vehicle charging stations may be, but as we begin to include this within the community, there will be more and more accessibility for this kind of technology and for electrical vehicle charging stations. So,
There's three different levels of charging stations. Which ones are we gonna ask that they provide? There's a level 1, which is 110, level 2, which I think is probably what we're after, and then level 3, which is DC, and you can charge in an hour, but would be very expensive.
so we do not currently address that in the code recommendations put forth. Now, I will say what is seen comparable in other cities is a level 2 charger.
Okay, but I think we need to specify that, because basically you can charge a car by, excuse me, plugging it into your house outlet.
Right.
It takes forever, but you can do it. Well, they would say, hey, we got it, we have an outlet outside, they can go plug into that. So I think we need to be specific about what we're asking for.
Right.
And along with this, since we're asking them to do something, is there any thought of providing an incentive for going above and beyond what we're asking for? Electric vehicles seem to be the wave of the future. The biggest thing is the charging stations themselves. It would seem to me in the best interest of the developer to put them in, because otherwise you're gonna have people who want to rent from you because you can't charge your card there. At the same time, there's gonna be people stuck in developments with no charging station who will say, I'll never buy an electric car because I live here where I can't charge it. So I'm thinking we need to look at this a little further, make sure we know what level we're talking about. And then if we want to stick our nose into the business of whether or not the developer has to add this, maybe we ought to insist on a little bit more, or perhaps ask them to put in the infrastructure short of the charging station. You know, put enough power to the potential place to put in a charging station without having to rewire the whole facility. I think this is one thing in the presentation that I've got some concerns with, and I think we can do a little better with.
I understand, and those are all good thoughts, and those are all something that we see. I actually attended just over this weekend a planning conference that addressed electric vehicle parking, electric vehicle code provisions. Something that we often see is a different ratio, similar to what you described, of having electrical conduits underneath. There may not be a charging station there, but a certain amount is equipped so that, let's say the technology becomes extremely common. It won't be cost prohibitive later to retrofit those spaces with a charging station. These are things we've considered in terms of the analysis. Right now, we wanted to get started at least with the baseline requirement. There are probably details, and again, that's what this work session is for, is to kind of determine what things may need to be clarified, what further steps may need to be taken. Again, level 2 is generally what we see when it's like a commercial thing, just because not like a full-on charge, but it's something to kind of keep you going as a stopgap. Homes definitely need to be, and homes are something that we're not yet addressing, because most homes can be equipped with their own conduit lines and everything, and newer homes should be equipped with, or should be ready to have this kind of electrical vehicle charging. But when we're looking at somewhere like a Fry's, you're only spending so much time there, so I think it should be above level 1, and again, that's why we see level 2, and if that needs to be further codified or further clarified, we can put that in there as well.
I think it does. Otherwise, it's a loophole.
Along the same point, first of all, there's multiple different types of plugs now, I guess, and there's at least 2, and I think there may be more than 2. There should be a minimum on this. So, for example, the way it's written right now, if you have one parking spot, you need to supply an electric charger. So you may want to have, at least 100 parking spots or something before you're requiring it for everybody.
Right, and in this case, I believe within the actual code, there's a mention of a fractional rounding.
Okay.
So were you to round down, you would need about 125 parking spots already to begin to approach the fraction of needing to require one. That was something we considered, for instance, again, looking at the needs of where you would be charging an electrical vehicle. Like if we're looking at a McDonald's that has, like, let's say about 35 parking spaces, but people are only going to be there for about 15, 20 minutes, and you're not going to get much use out of an electrical charging station anyway. So the most straightforward way to address that was with these larger parking lots. It's currently where we see it most of the time, as opposed to introducing the burden for almost every development. We agree that it would be a bit too much and a bit impractical to require every single development of any type to have an electrical vehicle charging station. We can, again, put an actual code minimum in. I've seen, for instance, one relation to the number 250 is other cities have used that as the guideline of once you have 250 charging spaces, that's when 250 parking spaces, that's when a charging station would be required. There's, again, of course, a lot of different components to this. A lot of different numbers could be used. In terms of just our analysis and what we've seen and looked at within the city, this is what our recommendation currently is. But again, at this work session, we're looking for any feedback that you may have, anything that should be addressed, so.
And in residential areas, I guess this gets more into the electrical demand planning. So, right now, it's probably typical that most houses have 100 amp service. If you're gonna go to electric vehicle charging, then I guess you're gonna have to upgrade just about everybody to 200 amp service so that you're getting 30 amps on a level 2 charger. Is that becoming a requirement for new developments?
Well, they usually are 200 amp.
Yeah, I think most
Home
houses
built.
are
Okay,
200.
Probably
yeah.
200 amp already. Yeah.
Okay, you're putting in 200 amp now?
Residential typically is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I believe that some of this is addressed more within building codes. On a planning level, we don't, within the zoning ordinance, we don't generally regulate the interior works of a single-family home. But this is becoming more and more prevalent, and I believe the newer electrical codes do address this kind of issue and that kind of concern.
See, my concern is more with the multifamily residents.
Right.
Apartment style, to where the home, well, not homeowner, but the renter, they can't modify the unit itself, even if it does have a garage.
Yeah.
They're not typically allowed to do something like that. So that's where I want to see to where maybe they at least put the conduits in for future. That way, if this does become larger, then we can kind of have it like that.
I think at one point too, economics are gonna take over. If you
Well, I
don't-
think it
if
will.
you don't have charging stations, you're not gonna rent, but in the meantime, we need to do the encouragement, because the other side is if they aren't there,
We're gonna end
people
up
aren't
with a
gonna buy-
bunch of
aren't
older,
gonna buy the cars.
Apartment, multifamilies that can't have this, and, it's less desirable. And, I'd like to see these things stay nicer and more in demand, and, I don't wanna see them become less demand.
Right. And we've considered these issues.
Yeah,
In terms of making this, the recommendation you see was, I believe, what we would call the minimum baseline.
Yeah.
Was that at least we need this.
yeah.
There's all sorts of different arguments that could be made regarding cost and regarding the different requirements. That is why we have this, but if moving forward, we want to establish a baseline percentage of how much should be
'Cause running
what
a
we
piece-
call EV
yeah.
capable.
Running a piece of conduit costs
Yeah.
next to nothing for future expansion compared to, they don't have to put the wire and everything in, comparing ripping, parking lots up to do this in the future, so.
Yeah, but they don't use conduit anymore.
We are treading somewhat new ground. There are cities who have done this, of course, but most cities, in terms of our research, are yet to approach it. But it's something that has been a consistent question, something that we've looked at. So we
We're
can
gonna-
rework this,
we're
of
gonna
course.
lead the way.
Yeah, out of, for a large part, even just looking within the Phoenix Valley, there were only a couple cities that had anything regarding electric vehicle charging.
Well, it's gonna be real interesting to see how these electric batteries hold up in the heat.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair,
Beyond me, though.
So what I'm hearing is that we're thinking of requiring a housing development to install electric vehicle charging stations for the convenience of those people that live there. In my personal opinion, I don't think as a property owner or a developer that it's my responsibility to make sure that somebody can charge their car. Because last time I checked where I live, they didn't put up a gas station either. Now, I understand that a lot of people are thinking that this electric vehicle thing is going to be a really big thing, and it quite possibly could. But to demand that an apartment complex provide an electrical vehicle charging station because somebody might not want to rent there if they couldn't charge their vehicle doesn't make much sense to me.
Well, I think,
If you put it in a parking lot at Fry's, I can understand that. Then it would be advertised on whatever media sites they have for where, oh, I'm getting down to 10%, I need to find a place to charge my car. That's the same thing as trying to find a gas station. Okay, that's acceptable to me. But demanding that a development, or housing development puts these in for the convenience of their residences isn't something that I find necessary, because there are adapters that you purchase with your vehicle to connect to your home to charge your vehicle. It's the same thing that they do with golf carts or any other electrical vehicle that we happen to have running around our community. You can do it from your home. And it's not that big of a deal. 6-8 hours, you can charge up a golf cart really quick off your house.
right, but you can't charge a car level 1 in 6 or 8 hours.
It's not my responsibility
isn't,
to
but-
ensure that somebody can
But if
charge
we're,
their car.
if we're going to do it, now I think, I see your point, I really do. It's if we're going to do it or not. If we're going to ask for them to have these in there, then let's ask for the upgrades we've been discussing.
Well,
But are we going
I agree,
to?
you're not gonna put in the minimum to satisfy the need, but I don't see where it's our responsibility to dictate to a housing developer or a condominium builder that he provide X number of electrical vehicle charging stations on the whim that somebody's not gonna rent there because they don't have charging stations.
Well, I think it's more than the whim. I mean, part of it is encouragement of a change. I mean, the government's been encouraging different changes all along. The federal government has great encouragement for electric vehicles. That program comes and goes. What this is a city taking action to encourage the use of electric vehicles. Now, whether it's appropriate or not for the city to do that is definitely a point of contention. Do we think we should do this as a city? We're encouraging the use of electric vehicles, and we're doing it through an ordinance. Can we do it rather than make it mandatory? I brought up before, can we do it with an incentive rather than making it dictatorial that you have to put in this? If you do put in this, you'll get this kind of break in developmental fees. And that way, we have everybody winning and not having that feeling of it shoved down their throat. They make the choice, but they make the choice to take advantage of the incentive by putting it in. Because in the long run, it's going to be better for all of us if we go to electric vehicles. There's so many changes going place, it's reflective of the horse and buggy age going to gasoline. If you look at the first 20 years of gasoline cars, you got a pretty interesting variety of what was going on. But eventually it streamed down into, like you said, we have gas stations everywhere, and we've gotten organized to gas cars as compared to, well, there's some places where you can still tie up a horse in Apache Junction, but not a lot. But the future is going to be the electric vehicle more likely than not. And how are we going to prepare to meet that future? And how are we going to encourage the community to be ready for that future? And I think by providing incentives rather than forcing it on them might be a way to get better cooperation. And that would honor what you're saying, Dirk, is we're not shoving it down the developer's throat. We're giving them the opportunity to take advantage of an incentive or say, no, I don't want to bother with that.
Commissioners, if I may, we as staff, we had these exact conversations, these very passionate conversations, and we see both these points very clearly. So what we wanted to do with these text amendments is just provide a minimum baseline. And that's kind of why we went with the 250 mark. We didn't feel that that was overly burdensome for a developer. In fact, we have recognized, and you guys have probably recognized as well, seeing development throughout the years, is that the private sector is a lot quicker in terms of reacting to market change than government can ever be. So, you know, they have their ear to the street, and they know what their residents want, and they are competing with each other. And that is why, as you've probably seen throughout the years, apartments are a lot nicer than they used to be 20 years ago, in terms of architecture, in terms of design, in terms of amenities that they provide. You know, some of these apartment complexes even have theaters in them, and they have full gyms and spas. So in terms of vehicle parking requirements, you know, they're going to be a lot more reactive than government can be. So we want to just provide a very flexible minimum baseline. And Mr. Shanebeck, I think you provide a great point to having a level 2 charger, and we'll definitely take a look at that. But to Mr. Begeman's point, yeah, absolutely. You know, we don't want to go above and beyond, or I guess provide too much of a burden for them, because at the end of the day, if it's too burdensome, then the developer will actually just ask for a PD amendment, which means just a deviation from the code, and we don't want that as either. So we want to kind of be somewhere in the middle to encourage that minimum level of change, and that'll be the incentive for kind of setting the trend forward. But we also don't want to be overly burdensome to kind of go in the other direction and discourage it.
And one more thing, as far as incentives, the possibility of incentives, it's probably not going to be development fees, Joel?
Well, however you could fit them in. I don't care if you give them a bunny rabbit at Easter.
Wanted to throw that out there.
Any kind of incentive you can find to encourage it. I was looking at costs, and a level 2 can get you anywhere between about $3,000 and $6,000. That's one level 2 charger for 250 spaces. You figure how much money is going into that whole development, and what fraction of 1% are we adding to their costs?
Yeah, so Commissioner Shanebeck, so another conversation that we had while drafting this code was economies of scale. So just like what you said, the infrastructure will probably already be there to have additional charging stations, right? But it'll be up to the developer to make a logical, rational decision. Say, hey, you know, this is a large development. Most likely, there's going to be, 2 or 3 Teslas here, or electrical vehicles. Since the infrastructure is already here, it would probably be an economic decision to say, why don't we have 2 or 3? But we just want to provide just a minimum of 1 per 250. So.
Mr. Chair, how many charging stations does the city have?
Commissioner Begeman, that's a great question, and I'm not sure. I know we have a couple here at the MGC. I think 3 of them at the 3 of them.
I think there's 3 at the MGC Center, and I don't think there's any place else where the city has any.
I don't think the city itself has any more than those, but in terms of overall Apache Junction, I'm not sure what other private sites offer electric vehicle charging.
Some of that has to do with the recency of development. You know, we've had a lot of development projects come through just within the past few years, and we're as anxious as you are to see everything that has been proposed and has been approved get developed. Within some of those projects, some of them have already indicated that electrical vehicle charging will be provided. But again, with what has currently been built, something that's been built, even just looking back 5 years ago, the technology was far less common than it is now. Other than the 3 that Sydney has mentioned, I'm not aware of any specifics within the city. But I know that within development that has been recently approved, things that are in the pipeline to be built, there is more already coming down the line, and that again has to do with this developing technology. And in this case, we're trying to get, I don't even want to say ahead of the curve, because we almost don't have anything. if the demand for it comes fast enough, but the development to introduce new chargers does not come quick enough or at a similar rate, then we simply won't have any, except for the 3 that we have at the MGC, so.
Does anybody have a way of finding out how many times or how often those charging stations at the MGC get used?
There may be statistics with the Parks and Recreation Department. We can check into that for you.
The reason I say that is I've gone by there numerous times. I go to the library like
Right.
twice a week on average, and I haven't seen anybody there that I can recall in any of those charging stations. Now, I did see a big truck sitting there once, but I know he wasn't charging because he was spewing diesel dust out. But I'm just curious as to how much usage those charging stations do get.
Right.
Because I know we have some people in town that do have electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. I know I sat next to one and was afraid he wasn't going to make it through the light. But if the usage or the need isn't there, I understand wanting to be ahead of it, but demanding that a housing development supply certain amenities such as a charging station, I don't get.
Well,
I mean, that'd be like us demanding they put in a washer and dryer system too, you know, or a dishwasher.
I think excuse.
Go ahead.
I think part of it is we're talking about 3 different things here. Your proposal was dealing with commercial parking areas.
In this case, commercial and multifamily, as noted. Some of the other parking regulations were specifically commercial, but for electrical vehicle, it does include in this
Okay, I
case.
assumed it was non-residential multifamily was, not included in this.
Multifamily, it says,
Well,
but we're talking more like apartment complexes, to where they can't modify their own
okay,
unit.
yeah. There's 3 different, you have the commercial side, the fries. You have places that have dedicated parking, like garages.
Right.
And I think where I live, we must have 20 or 30 electric vehicles that are all charged in their garages, which is where most residential people are going to charge it. And then the other question is, what do we do with multifamily that does not have dedicated parking spots? And that's where the rub is. If you have it dedicated, then you're gonna put in your own. If you're in a commercial, the commercial developer's gonna put it, and what do we do in the middle? And, yeah, I think that's gonna evolve.
And that's where I suggest maybe at least look at the conduit being put in
Yes.
place, and that for future, so it'd be economical to at least upgrade at that
Yeah.
point. And that
Yeah,
would provide
yeah.
minimal burden on the contractor.
It's a lot easier to put the wiring in
Just pull it through.
ahead of time when you're in construction than it is after the fact.
Yep.
And we agree. There's
Yeah.
there's many components to this. It's a developing technology, and this is a developing field of law. So in terms of what gets required, what should be required, there's a lot of, unresolved questions, I suppose. Out of me personally doing a lot of these studies, studied a lot, spent a lot of time studying, there just wasn't as much study when it came to the electrical vehicle parking requirements. We chose what we believed was a good baseline, but we're definitely open to these ideas and concerns, and we'll return to you with a different draft that incorporates more of this.
And your crystal ball ain't showing you a clear picture, right?
Yeah, and that's the difficulty, it's our career. We're planners, we plan for the future. We try and anticipate growth as well as change in demand, different things like that. This is one that, I'm not an automobile engineer, nor am I an automobile salesman. So
best
different
guess.
states have handled this in different ways on a state level. I don't think we're going in the direction of California that's trying to outlaw specific things,
Let's
but
meet in the middle, so.
but we're trying to anticipate demand, just as more and more of it has shown up on the streets.
And it's an emerging technology, and we don't know what's going to work. We all have experience with batteries around here. I had to replace my car battery, and they gave me an 8-year car battery and say, you'll never have to pay for another battery because it will never last more than 2 years if you're lucky.
I went through 3 of them,
Yes.
like back to back. I get it, yeah.
One of my neighbors is a snowbird from Edmonton, Alberta, okay? And they've tried electric vehicles up there. And when, in the winter, they get 50 kilometers, which is 30 miles on a full charge. And that's assuming you don't have the heater on when it's 20 below zero. So
But again, that's.
who knows what's gonna happen?
Yeah, that's today's technology, too.
Right, I understand. Who knows what's gonna happen, what's gonna develop?
Well, and if I can add, there's already companies out there that are treating these like, let's say, a vending machine. So it's a business opportunity for some people. So rather than being a mandated thing and for smaller places or for larger areas, the private sector is already kind of taking care of that, where someone's saying, well, shoot, we can put a bunch of these out there, you charge per whatever, kilowatt hour, whatever, and charge credit card and bang, so.
Yeah,
you know,
it's the same principle as a gas station.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know if when Fry's puts these in, if Fry's is gonna cover the expenditures, which they shouldn't have to, they'll probably have it set up where you run your card and it just pulls off whatever.
Yeah, they're not covering it.
Yeah.
You gotta pay for them, so they're not eating it. They might, usually they'll have a vendor who'll pay to put them in.
Well, that's another component to this, and we didn't want to get into government
And we're not-
regulation of this,
and
yeah.
we're not trying to
Oh, yeah.
mandate that.
No, but in terms of our study and in terms of what we found, there are all sorts of different avenues for this. Some sell advertisement space, where you have like a little panel, and when you're charging your car, you're watching an ad. I
That's on
guess.
them, how they wanna pay.
Some of them do, some have revenue sharing with the utility company or whatever the electrical company is, where a developer, through some contracts, lease agreements, gets to cash in on every cent of electricity sold. There's all sorts of different mechanisms to do it. We didn't necessarily want to, not that you were, but I mean, we as planners weren't trying to touch that just because there's a lot of flexibility, and there are private industry incentives to do so. But it's a valuable thing to recognize that component, that's one aspect that the industry is working around as well. So,
Yeah, I just care about our resident that's stuck, you know, kind of in a place to where they don't have to run down the Fry's, you know, because they rent a place, you know, and they're not allowed to modify their unit, you know. You can't run an extension cord 200 feet to where you park your car from your apartment. That's what I'm more worried about. Because, you know, if businesses can make money off it, they're going to. You know, as they build these new units and there's a demand for it, these new units are obviously gonna put them in.
Yeah.
Because they're building them at the time. I'm worried about these, as we build new units now, that it's not the thing. At least if we have stuff in there to to where they can add it in the future easily, we can keep these units that'll be a little bit older units in the future more up to date easily. That way they don't become the old unattractive units. That's what I want us to prepare for. That way, we don't have a bunch of these units that people tend to shy away from. You know, they turn into low-income units, that type of stuff. I want to keep our stuff nice and for the future. And if
now
we-
again, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. And if we can do it with simple stuff, let's do
Yeah.
it.
Again, there's always a question of what's the right number.
Right.
Like, I can say that within my study, as this is an approach that many cities have taken, some have gone as high as 20% of all parking spots have that wiring capable underneath. Whether or not that's too high, this is the kind of thing that when we are determining the needs of Apache Junction specifically, it's like we may not be as high as Central Phoenix.
Right.
But just as an estimate, so I'll say we'll probably return with a number a little lower than 20%. But wanted to put that out there just so we're not
Yeah, and technology might.
crunching numbers a month from now.
Technology could easily change to where like the power that we need for one of these units could then supply 6 of these units. So if they have the conduit and stuff there to do one, they could in the future maybe do 6. So
Well, we'll
there's
return
all
with the
kinds of things
revised.
that could happen, you know, so we don't know any of that, so. But at least if we kind of prepare, it leaves avenues open.
Right.
Nick, has this been advertised yet?
No, this has not been advertised and scheduled for a public hearing, so at this time,
Mr. Chairman,
still a work session.
Mr. Chairman, is it the preference of the commission to come back to you for one more work session? Or next time we come back to you, would you like to go ahead and have your public hearing?
I think we should do one more work session with everything ironed out with the you know, like, stage 2 and everything, and that way we can make sure it looks good before we push it through.
And we can come back at the next meeting, Nick?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thankfully, I've studied this.
Yeah.
These are good, commonly even expressed concerns, different ways to handle this emerging technology. We had made our recommendation just based on what we kind of, to be frank, as simplistic as we could get it, just as a baseline start. We wanted to get it started without getting too lost in the weeds, because, you know, developers as well as the public read our code, and they need to be able to understand it. So we started with a basic ratio, but as has been noted, there are definitely items to address.
Well, thank you for all the work, hard work and research.
Yes, thank you.
I think it's a great baseline. I think it's a great start.
All right.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Yeah, when I read this, I was a little, you know, reserved on the 1 per 250. I mean, if this technology takes off, the developers are gonna be putting in more than 1 per 250. But now I'm kind of getting that, you just want to, we're kind of planting the seed for these guys that, yeah, we want 1 per 250, but it's up to you guys how much you're gonna put in. And I suspect there'll be more than that as, you know, as the demand for these electric vehicles increases. If the demand doesn't increase, the 1 for 250 can be contested by the developer through an amendment, which I know we don't want to have a lot of those, but, you know, that's not a huge deal. So I'm pretty happy with what you've got going here.
That was the initial thought, yeah.
Yeah, I think the stage 2 needs to be called out,
Yeah.
as opposed to putting a 110 outlet there like was brought up earlier.
Yeah.
So, I think we're in a good place.
Not that I want to be right here doing this exact same thing in 2 years, but this being a changing and developing technology, that was something staff anticipated, that, again, not having that crystal ball,
Right.
this very well may be something that will need to be addressed in 5 years, you know, depending on where we are at. But exactly as you stated, this is what we believe is a good planting a seed, getting started. Again, this was not the main intent of the text amendment, but as something that had been brought up as a concern within past public hearings at the same time as guest parking. It fit to at least introduce some kind of start, some baseline standard at this time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and the guest parking, that's great. I'm glad we don't have to talk about that anymore.
Well, it's pretty generous, and that's good, too. You went to the high end rather than low end, and I think with Apache Junction's limited on-street parking, that the more guest spots we have, the better. So I think that .3 is also right on the money there.
Yeah, I mean, I included within the staff report, but there's all sorts of different ways in which we crunch numbers, but also a big part of it was just evaluating the need of the city. You know, it's, even if I take an average of developments, that's not something that necessarily dictates what's good for the city, but we believe that the .3 ratio, so 3 for every 10 units, was good at meeting the needs of the city when it came to on-street parking, off-street parking. So hopefully, and we're confident that this will address that need with development moving forward.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
So again, as was noted, this is not yet scheduled for a public hearing. There are other amendments when it comes to different parts of the Article 1.7, parking, loading, and circulation, that have to do with specifically trailer parking is something that I believe will be addressed at an upcoming discussion and work session with the Planning and Zoning Commission. Again, just to note, there were other minor edits, just things like correcting spelling, as well as just reorganizing where tables appeared. Since the way it was currently organized, every table appeared at the very end of the section. This is just a minor, you know, organizational correction, just to make it more accessible for people. It was a common question of where do I find the parking requirements? Because anyway, so
Right.
some aspects of this article have been reorganized, but nothing else has been changed beyond what we've discussed here and these minor administrative edits.
All right. Outstanding.
Thank you.
And I believe we've had an open discussion, plenty of questions all throughout, but if there's anything else, I, of course, am here to answer.
I think we're in a good place. Rob?
I'm good.
No,
Okay.
no, I'm thinking, number one, young people aren't buying vehicles. I mean, that's become a thing, not to have a vehicle. So I think that the emergence of the EVs is going to be a little slower than perhaps even the automotive people think.
I think the
And I
balance of that
also
might be
think
the-
that developers are smart enough to do what they need to do to attract the buyer or the renter. They're not going to just throw something up and say, oh, well, they need to make money off of it. They're going to do whatever it takes to attract that person to rent or buy in their place. So I think that these are very good standards. I like the 0.3. I think it's perfect that way. I think it, especially when you gave the table of the other developments that we've seen and showed what theirs was. Some of the ones we were really concerned with are the ones that have the 0.1 and 0.2.
Yeah.
So I think that shows that that concern now can be taken care of in new developments. So yeah, good job, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
We have no new business. Any information reports? I don't have any. Do you guys have any? All right. Director's report, Rudy?
Just a very quick announcement, Mr. Chairman, that this Friday is the City Council's retreat at CAC, their community college over here, and it is open to the public. And if you want to attend, you're more than welcome to. It starts at 8:30, from 8:30 to 4. And I believe the agenda is out. It's a general, well, there's a few topics of discussion, but it should be interesting, and we welcome you to attend if you want to.
Rudy, is it possible at a meeting to get an update on our developments that are in progress?
Sure.
I've got some real concerns that we're looking at the same situation 2008 where things stop and get abandoned on site.
The city has a map.
Well, that's what I'm concerned about, is we can get a report on what's going on.
Sure.
I'd appreciate it, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Selection of meeting dates, times, location.
Mr. Chair,
Robin?
I move that we have a regular meeting at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, April 25th, 2023, in the City Council chambers located at 300 East Superstition Boulevard, Apache Junction.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Rudy, can I get a roll call?
Commissioner Barker.
Yes.
Commissioner Callan.
Yes.
Chairman Hanchey.
Yes.
Vice Chairman Gage.
Yes.
Commissioner Cantwell.
Yes.
Commissioner Shanebeck.
Yes.
Commissioner Begeman.
Yes.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I thank you all.
Thank you.
And now adjourn the meeting at 7:59.